The story begins with George and Harold, two mischievous fourth-grade boys, outside their school with their latest creation, an origin issue of their comic book series, Captain Underpants. Suddenly, Mr. Krupp, their strict principal, snatches the comics and tears them to pieces. The boys are summoned to Mr. Krupp's office, where they find him sitting motionless, seemingly asleep with his eyes open. As they attempt to sneak out, the door suddenly slams shut, as if locked on lockdown. Mr. Krupp accuses George and Harold of changing the school sign to read, "Come to see my hairy armpits," even though he has no proof of their involvement. Despite this, he is certain that the boys are responsible for the recent string of pranks at the school. Before dismissing them, Mr. Krupp ominously threatens to catch them in the act one day. As George and Harold make their way through their school's bleak, prison-like hallways, they cannot help but feel that their classmates are leading miserable lives. Even the classes are unbearable, leaving the boys with no choice but to turn to pranks and practical jokes for entertainment. Not long after, when they return to their classroom, Melvin confesses that he snitched on George and Harold to the principal in an attempt to ingratiate himself with their strict school leader. Later that day, an announcement from the principal blares over the intercom, informing the students of the upcoming mandatory invention convention, which will take place on Saturday. He urges them to arrive at the school early, at 8 a.m., promising that they will be dismissed at 9 p.m. Everyone is unhappy about this news except for Melvin, who seems thrilled at the prospect. After school, George and Harold meet at their treehouse, which they affectionately refer to as the headquarters of Treehouse Comics Incorporate. As they sit and reminisce, they remember the first time they met in kindergarten when their teacher was discussing the planets of the solar system. They accidentally blurted out Uranus instead of Uranus, instantly bonding over their shared sense of humor. George and Harold have been best friends since their fateful meeting in kindergarten. Harold is a talented artist, while George is a gifted storyteller, and together they have created numerous comics in their treehouse hideout. Their most beloved creation is the superhero Captain Underpants. The two boys spend their Saturday afternoons reading and making comics until the evening. Finally, the long-awaited Saturday arrives, and George and Harold are thrilled to have a day to do whatever they please, whether lounging in their pajamas all day, watching TV, or even wearing their underwear on their heads. However, their mothers remind them that they must attend the mandatory invention convention at school. Not long after, George and Harold arrive at their school, and Mr. Krupp introduces Melvin, who presents his 17 creations for the convention. While Melvin explains his creation, the other students struggle to stay awake. George got a plan to liven things up and convinces Harold to join him in a prank. They sneak onto the stage as Melvin presents his final invention, the turbo toilet. After they tamper with Melvin's turbo toilet controls, it goes haywire, shooting toilet paper everywhere and bringing the students back to life with a wild toilet paper party. Just as Harold and George think they've pulled off a brilliant victory, Mr. Krupp summons them to his office, along with Melvin. There, Melvin presents his latest invention, the Tattle Turtle 200, a nanny cam disguised as a stuffed turtle that Mr. Krupp used to finally gather evidence of George and Harold's involvement in the prank. In reward for his betrayal, Melvin is given extra credit, while George and Harold are punished by being placed in separate classes. That night, George and Harold worry about the implications of being separated for the first time since kindergarten. They wonder what their lives will be like years from now, and how their friendship will survive. Determined to save their bond, George asks Harold to return to school and retrieves the recording from the Tattle Turtle 200. While they hide in a utility closet, they witness Edith, the school's lunch lady, bringing a tuna casserole she made for Mr. Krupp. When Harold and George search for the stuffed turtle inside Mr. Krupp's office, they stumble upon a collection of items that Mr. Krupp has confiscated over the years. Suddenly, Mr. Krupp emerges from behind and calls them out. He has tied the turtle to his legs, so it will always be with him, even in the shower. As Mr. Krupp threatens them with paperwork for separate classes, George leaps onto the table and brandishes the hypno ring, threatening to use it on him. To their surprise, every object in the room suddenly levitates into the air and then drops back down. Mr. Krupp is unconscious, and Harold quickly grabs the stuffed turtle while George commands the hypnotized Mr. Krupp to transform into a chicken. At first, they are skeptical, but to their amazement, Mr. Krupp obeys their every command. Shortly after, George grabs the comic book on the floor, and when he shows it to Harold, they have the same idea to transform Mr. Krupp into Captain Underpants. Mr. Krupp has become Captain Underpants and is fearless but reckless as he jumps out of the office window and heads across the street, causing a stir wherever he goes. George and Harold chase after him, but when they take their eyes off him for a moment, they find him on the roof, trying to wrestle with a giant monkey blow-up balloon. Using a wrecking ball crane, George and Harold manage to save Captain Underpants, who even manages to catch a group of bank robbers in the process. Back at the treehouse, they try to figure out how to reverse the hypnotism, and when Harold splashes Captain Underpants with water, he transforms back into Mr. Krupp. When George snaps his fingers, he becomes Captain Underpants again. The boys have so much fun with this that they continue playing until Mr. Krupp gets knocked out. They drag his unconscious body back to his house in a wagon, where a creepy, run-down exterior greets them. When they venture inside, they are surprised to find that Mr. Krupp's home is quite normal. As they snoop around, they realize how sad and miserable Mr. Krupp's life is, and they begin to feel sorry for him. They worry about being placed in separate classes, and consider using this newfound knowledge to manipulate Mr. Krupp. The next day, Mr. Krupp confronts George and Harold, threatening them with paperwork for separate classes. George snaps his fingers, and Mr. Krupp immediately transforms into Captain Underpants. George and Harold quickly shove Captain Underpants into a closet, but they realize they can't stay hidden forever. They convince Captain Underpants to pose as the school principal and head to the principal's office. Along the way, they run into Edith, who finds it suspicious when Captain Underpants doesn't remember eating her tuna casserole. Drawn by Edith's blue eyes, Captain Underpants can't help but flirt with her. When they arrive at the principal's office, they are greeted by an old man applying for a vacant science teacher position at the school. Captain Underpants conducts the interview and confirms that the candidate has no teaching experience and has spent the last decade earning the nickname Revenge Seeker. Despite the many red flags, Captain Underpants unwittingly hires him. George and Harold try to fix the problem before Mr. Krupp finds out, but while playing with a squirt gun, Captain Underpants accidentally splashes himself with water, turning him back into Mr. Krupp. The new teacher, Professor P, meets with his class and announces that he aims to eliminate laughter. Melvin tries to ingratiate himself with the new teacher, while Harold tries to figure out why the new professor wants to rid the world of laughter. When he doesn't get a satisfactory answer, George takes the opportunity to make everyone laugh with silly jokes. The new professor sends them to the principal's office, where Mr. Krupp has turned back into himself, but they turn him back into Captain Underpants again. After Harold and George got the new professor's file, they discovers that his last name is Poopy Pants, which explains his desire to rid the world of laughter. They use this valuable information in their latest issue of Captain Underpants and the perilous plot of Professor Poopy Pants. Professor Poopy Pants reveals that his panic attacks are fueled by the fear of being laughed at, even if he succeeds as an inventor. His mission is to eliminate laughter from the world. When he catches Harold and George as the culprits behind the comic, he takes them to the school principal, who happens to be Captain Underpants. The principal is amazed by the comics and demands that Professor Poopy Pants teach the material at the school. As the two go over the material, Professor Poopy Pants becomes confused and later meets an anti-human boy who shares characteristics with Melvin and struggles to understand what is funny. Professor Poopy Pants believes that with Melvin's help, he will finally figure out how to eliminate laughter. Meanwhile, George and Harold enjoy controlling Captain Underpants and doing things that would be impossible for normal Mr. Krupp. Professor Poopy Pants uses this opportunity to examine Melvin's brain and discovers that he lacks the part of the brain responsible for laughter, which explains his lack of a shared sense of humor. Determined to rid the world of laughter, Professor Poopy Pants devises a plan to give Harold and George's supervillain, Captain Underpants, a sugar rush. Back at school, Harold and George continue their antics as they try to bring fun to the school. With Captain Underpants' help, they hold a carnival that quickly descends into chaos. The kids enter a sugar-fueled frenzy, while others get stuck in the cotton candy machine. The Ferris wheel even becomes loose and crashes into a building. As it starts raining, Captain Underpants turns back into Mr. Krupp, who is shocked by the chaos in his absence. He tries to make sense of everything, but can only conclude that Harold and George are responsible for everything. Harold and George try to turn Mr. Krupp back into Captain Underpants, but the rain prevents it from working. As a result, Mr. Krupp sends them to separate classes, and they struggle to adjust to not having each other's company. Professor Poopy Pants, on the other hand, decides to give Harold and George the supervillain they've envisioned in their comics. He asks Melvin to bring him the turbo toilet and turns it into a massive machine, but there's one problem: it has no gas. After searching for an alternative fuel source, Professor Poopy Pants decides to use the cafeteria's leftover food as fuel. Harold and George see the giant turbo toilet approaching the school and try to warn their teachers, but no one believes them. Harold and George meet in the bathroom and come up with a plan to stop Professor Poopy Pants. When the evil professor and Melvin arrive at the school with the giant turbo toilet, they reveal their plan to remove the part of the brain responsible for laughter by using Melvin as a power source for the beam and making all the other kids like him. Professor Poopy Pants calls out George and Harold, who are trying to come up with a plan when Mr. Krupp walks in on them in the bathroom. They snap their fingers and turn Mr. Krupp into Captain Underpants to fight off the evil professor and his diabolical scheme. Harold and George use Captain Underpants to distract Professor Poopy Pants while climbing the turbo toilet's back. They try to convince Melvin to remove the device on his head that powers the machine's beam, but he instead tattles on them. As Professor Poopy Pants catches on to Harold and George, they try to apologize for making fun of his name by making silly names for themselves. The professor claims there is nothing wrong with his full name, P.P. Diarrestian Poopy Pants. This makes George and Harold burst out in laughter, allowing the professor to capture them and beam them with the machine. It isn't long before they appear to lose their sense of humor. Professor Poopy Pants celebrates his victory and continues his mission on planets like Jupiter, Mars, and even Uranus. When Harold and George hear the word Uranus, they remember the first time they met and the joke they laughed at together, triggering their sense of humor so much that their laughter overpowers the machine, and everyone returns to normal. When they think everything is over, Professor Poopy Pants starts shooting the Scissorator 2000 at Harold and George. They scream for help and try to hide from the professor when Captain Underpants wakes up. He gets superpowers from the leftover fuel inside the turbo toilet and faces Professor Poopy Pants head-on. Captain Underpants manages to take out the Scissorator from the professor, who feels helpless and accepts defeat when Captain Underpants makes the mistake of turning the professor into a giant and shrinking himself with the gun. George manages to grab the Scissorator, but misfires and shrinks the school with everyone inside. Captain Underpants swoops in and grabs the school from the professor. As they wrestle for the Scissorator, Harold holds on to the professor and shrinks him, who manages to escape by riding a bee. George and Harold return to the treehouse and realize they must turn Captain Underpants back into Mr. Krupp, even if it means being separated into different classes. They realize that, despite being separated forever, they firmly believe they